Welcome to the Q&A for the film Santiago Rising on behalf of Alborada, Latin America Uncovered, and Alborada Films, a film production company. 25% of the ticket sales for tonight's film event will go to Ojos de Chile, Eyes of Chile, an organization working with the victims of state repression in Chile during the 2019 street protest. My name is Rodrigo Acuña. I'm a contributing editor of Alborada and host of Alborada's new podcast, Indestructible, Latin America with Rodrigo Acuña. I'm a former academic, the son of Chilean political refugees, and I have been writing on Latin American politics for approximately 15 years, predominantly in the Australian media. Nick MacWilliam is the director of Santiago Rising and co-editor of Alborada. He can be followed on Twitter at Nick MacWilliam. Carole Concha Bell is an Anglo-Chilean writer, journalist, and PhD candidate at King's College. A Chilean refugee, she is the founder of Chile Solidarity Network in the United Kingdom. Carole follows political developments in Chile closely. She writes regularly at The Canary and can be followed on Twitter at Chile Dissent. Now, as we have seen in the film, Chile's mass demonstrations commenced in October 2019 against decades of privatization and for a demand that the country's constitution, established in the early 1980s under the US-backed dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, be abolished. The protests were in fact so large, the right-wing government of Sebastián Piñera declared martial law, seeing the military on the streets of Chile for the first time since the end of the Pinochet regime in 1990. By the end of 2019, according to the National Institute of Human Rights, 4,364 people were arrested, including 479 children and teenagers, as a result of Chilean police and military firing indiscriminately into crowds of protesters. By the end of November, 232 people suffered eye injuries, while later it was reported approximately 50 people completely lost vision in one eye. According to Enrique Guevara Rosas, America's director at Amnesty International, and I quote, "Those in strategic command of the National Police allowed acts of torture and ill treatment to be committed against demonstrators because they considered them to be a necessary evil in order to disperse the crowd at all costs." Now, as we know, Chile's political class conceded to a plebiscite on the constitution. But before we discuss that, I'd like to ask Nick my first question, which is, Nick, why make the film Santiago Rising?
Okay, excuse me, a bit early here, still waking up. Thanks, Rodrigo. Thanks for hosting this event. Thanks to everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed the film. Obviously, there's elements in there that are not so enjoyable, but I also think one of the big messages that that we can take from what's happening in Chile was the sheer amount of joy and love and creativity. And that was a massive, for me, that was a very, very important part of the film and of what was happening out there, the joy of revolution and the love and the unity that was you know, just enveloping everybody who was involved in the protests. So before I answer your question as well, I just want to say thanks to everyone in Chile who spoke to me and helped me make this film. You know, there's a huge amount of voices in the film. And there's also a lot of people who didn't, you know, who aren't in the final cut for whatever reason, but I've still got their interviews and their footage. And then there was lots of other people just behind the scenes who allowed me to film, who opened their arms to what I was doing and were very supportive, had faith in my project, trusted me, you know, and bearing in mind the repression, the surveillance, the stigmatization and the threats that people out there are under. You know, it's no kind of small gesture to allow someone who's clearly an outsider. I mean, I'll come to that in a moment. I don't particularly feel like an outsider in Chile, but, you know, obviously I could come across that way to several people. But, you know, for them to believe and have faith in what I was doing was massively important. And this film obviously wouldn't have even got off the ground without that support that people on the streets facing terrible state violence. You know, without them, without their support, I couldn't have done it. So really, 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 my heart goes out to them. And having seen the sacrifice, the struggle and the commitment of everything they've been doing, I mean, I can only express my utter admiration and, you know, respect for what people in Chile have achieved and what hopefully they will go on to achieve as well. So I made the film because, well, basically my relationship with Chile is that I used to live there. I spent 4 years there between 2010 and 2014. If anyone Chilean is here, I arrived about 4 days after El Terremoto in 2010, the huge earthquake, which I think was the third biggest ever recorded. So that was another story that I just missed out on. But I was there for the aftermath. And it also happened to be the week that Sebastián Piñera came into office for the first time. I didn't go there because of Piñera. I just happened to arrive in the same week as he arrived in office. And I happened to stay for 4 years. So that was pretty much Piñera's entire first term, because he subsequently left office for 4 years. And then he was re-elected in late 2017 and took office in 2018 for the second time. So having lived there, I became quite familiar with many of the issues that are covered in the film. I became very aware of the economic model and the impact that had on so many people in Chile. I mean, you know, protest in Chile has been going on for, you know, forever and ever, as far as I can see. Obviously, it was repressed under the dictatorship, but you know, pre-dictatorship and even during that, you know, there was massive resistance in the dictatorship as well. So during my time there, you know, I became familiar with the Mapuche situation, which is covered in the film, with the terrible impunity which continues around the dictatorship. The vast majority of victims have never seen any form of justice, and the perpetrators have never, you know, most of them have never been held to account. Many of them actually had very high-profile political positions when I was there. My first year, I lived in a place called Providencia in Santiago, because that's where I was working. Then I quickly moved down to downtown Santiago to Barrio Brazil, which is much more kind of my vibe. But Providencia was, just to give an example, one of the streets through the main part of Providencia had been renamed under Pinochet, had been renamed 11th of September Avenue. And this was in reference to the date of the coup. Now, here I was arriving in 2010, and that street still had that name, you know. This is a terrible date in Chilean history, but that name had never been changed. The mayor of Providencia was a paratrooper, Joaquin Lave, who was he was a paratrooper in the Caravan of Death, which was essentially a death squad, which traveled all over Chile in the weeks following the coup, executing people basically, you know. And he was now a mayor of Providencia. So the people who've been committed some of the most horrific, appalling crimes not only had they not been held to account, they still held positions of public office, very, very powerful, influential, and wealth-generating positions. So this is kind of like the context that Chile has lived in. And, you know, that was after 20 years of democratic governments who had done nothing virtually to address the situation. Now, I lived there in 2011, and that year it started off with these massive environmental protests for this project, this hydroelectric project that was being built in Patagonia. And that sort of developed into these huge student protests. My perception of Chilean protest is that it will start over one cause, and then they all just kind of, you know, draw each other in. And, you know, there's so much, as people talk about in the film, a crossover. And having witnessed the student protest movement of 2011, which if you don't know about it, look it up, because that was intense. And I really, really learned about the militancy and the commitment and the stamina and the sheer strength of Chilean protest, because, you know, the students occupied schools, universities for 6 or 8 months, something like that, you know, just took them over, shut down the education system. And they did it with massive outpourings of creativity, of joy, and of rebellion. I remember the school just by my flat where I lived, you know, they stacked, and this was like the case everywhere, they stacked all the chairs up in with the chair legs pointing out, you know, from the gates of the school, and it looked phenomenal, you know, just the aesthetic of it. And then you got on the marches, and there were carnival atmospheres as you've seen in the film. So, you know, so my experience of that, I got very familiar with that. And I also got very familiar with the terrible levels of state repression that public protest always encounters. Yes. So in December 2019, I went back to Chile for the first time in just over 5 years. And it just so happened that before I went, the Estallido Social had begun. And I had, you know, kind of been getting into documentary filmmaking in the kind of year running up to that, maybe a bit longer. But I've been doing journalism around Latin America ever since I lived in Chile, really. So for getting around 10 years. And I mean, going there, yeah, you know, I just, as soon as the Estallido Social started, I mean, I knew I was going to do it. And any plan, I'd had my ticket to Chile booked beforehand to do some other stuff, just catch up with old friends, you know, but also do some filming and stuff. But I changed my plans, and I guess one of the good things about traveling by yourself is you can suddenly decide rather than going traveling around southern Chile, I'm just going to be throwing myself in the tear gas and the water cannon in Santiago instead. So one of the benefits of traveling on your own. So yeah, and then like, you know, it was just so phenomenal. That's another good thing, you know, of COVID is that it's given me a lot of time to sit at desk editing. So, you know, so that's what it was. And obviously I just kind of, my history and my relationship with Chile is very important to me, because my life today is basically, I wouldn't even be the person I am without having lived there. But I also wanted for people here to see some of that as well, and understand what happens in Chile and how Chilean culture and protest cross, and, you know, just the scale of it and the wonderful, you know, the wonderful unity and love that exists through it. So I guess that's kind of, you know, a summary of the multiple reasons why I wanted to make this film.
It was a wonderful film. It's excellent filming, so I really appreciate that. Before I move on to asking Carole and bringing her into the forum and asking her a question, I just want to remind our viewers that they can ask questions from 9:30 onwards. We'll be opening up questions to the public, and they can either appear on camera or they can just send us their questions in writing, and I'll read them out. Now, Carole, as I said, you follow political developments in Chile closely. What did you take from the film?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Alborada Films and Nick for making this film, because it's a very important historical documentation of the uprising. And so I'd like to thank you for that, and thank you, Rodrigo, for hosting this event. Well, the film is relevant in so many different ways. I'd probably need to write a thesis. First of all, it breaks through the media silence of Chile. As we know, the Chilean media is heavily biased. The people that own the media were supporters of the dictatorship and participated, and that hasn't changed. Nothing has changed since the dictatorship. So in Chile, there's a silence around what is happening on the streets for obvious reasons. And in Britain, I could just talk about Britain, there's a silence because Britain is now Brexiting and want to do trade with Chile. So this has been a massive headache to them. I think Boris Johnson would like to proceed selling arms to Chile. We have recently been doing a few investigations for the reasons of freedom of information. We haven't been able to find out exactly which arms have been supplied to Chile, but we highly suspect that the tear gas that is being used to blow out students' eyes, some of it is actually sent from the UK, a source of embarrassment. So there are many reasons why there is a kind of blanket silence around the fact that the estallido social happened, and then the sort of fallout and the violence that has surrounded the repression of the Chilean people. When I spoke to Nick the other day, he made a really good point, and he said that Chile likes to present itself as this posh, you know, white nation of South America, and right-wing and liberals like to look upon Chile as this successful model. You know, neoliberalism really works. You know, Hayek was right, and all this, but it hasn't worked. It's produced disastrous results, and these are all of the sort of reasons why the powers that be may want to shut us up So I think that the film is un aporte, I don't know, I've forgotten how to say that in English, is a real big contribution to combating this silence. Apart from it being a beautiful film to look at and a wonderful film for us to learn about what is happening in Chile, it also serves a political purpose. So there's that. Also, in terms of when it comes to Latin America, there seems to be, again, this kind of, there's not that much interest, particularly in the UK. So I feel that the film will bring the problems of Chile, this whole revolutionary vibe, to Anglophone audiences, whether it be in Canada, Australia, the United States, the UK. So that's brilliant, because there's a lot of footage in Spanish, and there have been a few films made here and there, but nothing like Nick has produced and Alborada films. So yes, it provides access to Anglophone audiences. And also something that Nick said the other day, which I actually quoted in the Canary article I wrote, about what has happened in Chile as a lesson to the world. In the UK, which Nick also pointed out the other day to me when we were speaking at Latin American Bureau, was that this is a lesson to the world. We heavily rely on parliamentary processes in the UK, and we devote a lot of time and energy to this. But Chile has shown us what can happen even without those institutions in place. Disaffected Chileans have actually taken their revolutionary background, the lessons learned from the dictatorship, to continue to combat this fake democracy that they're living in, this democracy, this negotiated situation that they're living in. So I feel like it's a great lesson, particularly at a moment of great global turmoil, where we're seeing institutions like fall apart, like in the United States, where, you know, it's supposed to be the bastion of democracy, and yet democracy has been abused to the point where we have a maniac, you know, in the White House. So I think that this film gives hope to grassroots movements and to people that feel disaffected and in despair, that actually there is a way. And maybe this Chilean model is something that we can replicate in other countries. Maybe we can form our own organizations. Maybe, you know, there is another way. You know, maybe the parliamentary way isn't the right way. Maybe democracy is broken. Maybe it's failing us, and maybe there's something we can do about it. So I think that the lesson that we can take from the film and from the actions of the Chilean people during El Estallido Social is a very important one, and it comes across very strongly in the film, and that's why I think this film is hugely relevant.
Thank you, Carole. If I can return to you, Nick, can you talk a little bit about the filmmaking process? Was it a difficult film for you to make?
So the filmmaking process, I mean, it was surprisingly, in terms of like meeting people and seeing people, it was surprisingly not difficult. You know, there was so much happening. You know, you could pretty much go out, and every single day, you know, I was there in December as well, so it's kind of over Christmas and New Year. So yeah, I think the protests had kind of not subsided, but reduced in size slightly. Kind of after the initial burst in October, I think kind of towards mid-November, they perhaps reduced slightly in size, but then around December, people were back into wanting to get things moving again in a very big way for the end of the year and things like that. So I benefited from being there at that time, because there was a lot of people organizing events and you know, like the last protest of the year, which is the one where we see the quite heavy police repression in the main plaza. That was the last, as a young woman in the film says, you know, this is the last march of the year, so everybody's come. I also, you know, I've got a lot of contacts in Chile. I know a lot of documentary makers, people, you know, protesters, and I was hooked up into various WhatsApp groups. So, you know, and anything that was going on was immediately put in the WhatsApp groups, and, you know, I just go there and start filming, you know. And so much of it was just a case of each day, you know, going, obviously I didn't know there was going to be a fire at the Centro Arte Alameda, you know, I didn't know there was going to be the death of a young protester. So some things you knew were going to happen, such as Fridays, you know, there's going to be a big protest. Sundays, you knew the cyclists were going to be there. But all in all, it was a case of just like almost on a daily basis, going out and just, you know, what's happening, tracking it down, speaking to people. But as you can probably tell from watching the film, like people were really keen to express themselves. You know, people often approached me to talk rather than the other way around, which I did as well, obviously. But you know, and everyone had a view, everyone had a story. You know, Chile's kind of got like a storytelling tradition, you know, and some of the greatest writers in Latin American history are Chilean. And you know, you kind of see that, and Chile, you know, Chile in itself is quite a flowery form of Spanish. So you know, they've got that kind of like a verbal tradition, I think, in Chile, and so people were keen to speak. And even when I commented on this to Pablo the other day, you know, Chileans are experts at swearing, and you know, that comes across in the film as well. And it's just, yeah, I just think it was so poetic what people were saying. So actually, like getting people to talk and you know, material to film was not that difficult. What was perhaps more concerning was, you know, the police. They were targeting journalists at times, and actually, when I was the scene where I'm in the bus going to the funeral, turning up there. You know, just in southern Santiago, a part of town that doesn't have the best reputation, so it's kind of like unusual to see foreigners there. But I was there, and I immediately got stopped by the police because I looked out of place to them.
Okay.
They opened up my bag, took out all my camera and stuff, and like it was kind of like, all right, you know, what, you're going to take my camera now, and trying to intimidate me because that's what they do and so forth. But immediately, there was 5 or 6 people stood right next to me immediately, just to make sure I was okay. They don't know me, you know, and it was, you know, it was a real, that was that kind of sense of companionship and support that I was getting from people. And, you know, just to make sure I was okay, you know, people like, just make sure you're okay, man. You know, they don't like people filming. And yeah, a few people were, you know, suspicious of what I was doing and completely justifiably so, because, you know, there are a lot of people, infiltrators in the protest movement, you know, and undercover police and things like that. And people have been arrested for stuff that's gone on social media in videos and things. So I completely understood that people didn't want to go on camera. And there were a lot of people who didn't want to go on camera. And there was a lot of situations I was in where I didn't film as well because it was too sensitive. But overall, I mean, it was an extremely inspiring and uplifting and joyful experience doing it. I mean, I was basically in tears when I had to leave because it had been a life-affirming few weeks for me.
Carole, if I can return to you, you have been very critical of the plebiscite and the proposed reforms for the Chilean constitution. What do you think is going to happen in future in terms of that whole process and the protest movement that sort of was put on pause because of COVID, but as we've seen lately, people have returned to the streets?
Well, I'm worried because I feel like the political class of Chile will always manipulate, and because they're so dominant and have destroyed political parties, I'm worried that the same people that are the problem will be vying to write the constitution. You know, we've already had Pinochet's niece, you know, applying to be one of the candidates. It's a disgrace. I'm worried about the way that the constitution will be worded. They will do their best to hang on to power. There is no way that the powers that be, the elites of Chile, are just going to hand their power over. It seems to me incredibly naive. I don't want to poo-poo what the Chilean people have achieved, but I feel that there's a lot of myth and a lot of spinning with regards to actual achievements. For example, you know, the plebiscite of 1988 was this, you know, it's in Hollywood, this big, you know, triumph of the people. It wasn't a triumph of the people. That was negotiated. That was, you know, we knew this was going to happen. And for fuck's sake, I mean, sorry the language, but if they had voted for yes, I mean, for God's sake. So I feel that there's been a lot of spin and a lot of veneer and a lot of myth about the triumphs, and not actually a lot has been achieved. So I'm worried that if the people don't get what they want, because it's a new generation of people, these kids are fearless. And like Nick, I happened to be in Chile in December. I felt elated, just like Nick did, and I cried my eyes out at the airport when I had to leave, because you know, all of the songs, it's a very emotive time. And it was, I went to Chile with a heavy heart. We were terrified. We thought the coup was happening here. You know, we were outside the embassy shitting ourselves, thinking, oh my God, it's happening again. These terrible videos coming through WhatsApp. And we organized quite quickly. But to be there and to experience this kind of joy and this energy was incredible. So I came back happy, but I am very skeptical, sadly, of this whole constitutional process. I think that I mean, these people are willing to kill, they are willing to murder, they own the press, you know, there's spies out there on the street. It's a heavily infiltrated society. So I'm very worried about the constitutional process, and also with the lack of, I have a problem, I'm an exile, I can't really read Spanish very well, especially jurisdictions and legalistic terminology. So it's hard to understand what is going on, but I firstly closely follow Mapuche candidates, for example, and there's been a few little things where they've messed about with the dates, and, you know, they've not quite managed to register. So I am extremely worried about this, and I'm worried about the fallout, because I think that if the people don't get what they want, they could fall into this huge disillusionment, the left could be destroyed again, or they could really unite and go forth with a huge protest, and then there'll be absolutely huge repression. I mean, the repression we've seen harks back to the dark days of the dictatorship. We've had rapes, we've had tortures, we're having a whole generation of young people losing their eyes. Where else can they go? How much more violent can it get? So while I'm pleased it's happening and I'm cautious about it, and I understand the power of the people and that they've managed to do this, I'm also worried about the way that it's been spun out here. That, you know, they've got a very good PR machine, these people. They've managed to spin Chile into this prosperous nation. And even during the protest, you know, Sebastián Piñera on the BBC about how worried he was about the protests and, oh, how terrible this violence is, and we'll catch these bastards, you know. But he's the one giving the orders. So these are very slippery Machiavellian types, and I think we cannot be naive. We need to follow it closely, and the devil is in the detail. The wording of the Constitution matters. Who writes it matters. And I'm just not confident that they're going to give up power that easily.
Thank you, Carole. If I can return to you, Nick, could you maybe just explain a little bit more in terms of how these protests were kicked off by the students, and just what is, you know, what does the privatization structure look like in Chile? Because it's a model that's sort of been embraced by many other parts of the world, but I think Chile is an extreme case, even for Latin American standards.
Well, I mean, I guess you have to be clear on what you think the objectives of this kind of model are, you know, and it's, you know, it's essentially about a huge transfer of not only resources and wealth, but political power from the people to the elites, you know, and that's kind of essentially what neoliberalism is. You know, up until the 1970s, you'd had a time of very strong social movements, of challenges to states, to capitalist systems, and then obviously in the 70s, there was a huge pushback against that, and that was pioneered under Pinochet. You know, Pinochet is the model, the economic laboratory. And the only way that could be achieved was through intense violence against the population. Obviously, you know, when trade unionists are being disappeared, when they're being tortured, murdered, when student activists are being disappeared, tortured, murdered, community leaders and so forth, that's bound to have an impact on people's ability to resist, you know, and as such, that allowed for these kind of policies to be put in place, you know, and there was no economic electoral system in which people could show their opposition to that, you know. To oppose was to be targeted. So what did that mean? You know, it looked like obviously the Allende had distributed lands. It meant all that land's being taken back. You know, so he'd given it up to landless peasants and rural communities in the south. He'd nationalized industry. You know, ensured that every community there were food supplies and you know, clinics available. And for that he was demonized in the international media. He faced, you know, a huge clandestine CIA-backed operation to undermine his government and to essentially remove him from office. And as everyone knows, the coup was only carried out with the support and active involvement of the US. Britain also obviously was very supportive of Pinochet. And it was Britain and the US which then most embraced the model that was being pioneered in Chile under Thatcher and Reagan. And this meant, you know, education became, in Chile, education became, you know, you could only get a decent education that would get you a well-paid job if you were from the upper sectors of society, you know. Not only is it, you know, do you face those barriers, but actually, you know, if you're from a lower income background, going to university, not only do you have to pay the fees, you have to take the loans to pay the fees, and the interest rates are so high that sometimes people from poorer backgrounds have to pay double what some people from higher earning backgrounds pay. So, you know, so the injustice and the imbalance there is vast. You know, for me, it was like I've lived in Britain most of my life, and the last final thing we have is a free health service. You know, it's the last thing we have, basically. They haven't been able to take that from us yet. So in Chile, for me, going to, like, the couple of times I had to go to the doctor and have to pay. I mean, I know this is a reality all over the world, but I still struggle with it. You know, and, you know, as Francisco Fernandez, the anthropologist in the film, says, you know, this was all achieved through a very oppressive and criminalizing model. You know, that also, you know, water is privatized, natural resources are privatized, and, you know, that's involved the displacement of Mapuche communities, violence against them, and so on and so on. And, you know, when Chile did return to democracy, inverted commas, you know, none of the political parties, the so-called centre-left parties, did anything really to challenge the fundamental basics of the model. And this, you know, as Beatrice Batizu says in the film, you know, this was a pacted transition which didn't fundamentally challenge the model, because, you know, as we've got, as in many countries which have a two-party system, will know, you're kind of, you know, there's not really that much to choose between them. The Chilean elite, you know, the political class was satisfied with the anti-trade union laws and the anti-environmental laws, and, you know, and damningly, really damningly, for later governments in the La Concertación, which is the, you know, the one that's supposedly centre left and was under Michelle Bachelet. You know, they continue to apply Pinochet's anti-terrorism law towards Mapuche activists. This meant people would get charged with terrorism over, you know, maybe an attack on a logging company vehicle or other fairly minor crimes which certainly don't constitute terrorism, you know. And that has never been changed, you know. So Pinochet's anti-terrorism law was still being used. I don't know if it's, I know there's been a massive backlash against it still. I don't know if it's actually right being used, but I mean, it had been used up until a couple of years ago. So, you know, like, there's been very little actual, you know, structural reform. And that includes the security forces, because as you can see, they're brutal, man. And the Carabineros were involved in the coup, and they have, I think they've still got a bust of Pinochet up at Escuela Militar, which is part of Santiago, with the military school. You know, Pinochet was a senator until 1998. No, sorry, he was head of the armed forces, I think, until 1998, and a senator until he died in 2006. So, you know, like, this has never really been dealt with in a way that has brought justice and has addressed the rights of the victims.
Yes. We have a question from the public. We have a question from, oh, sorry, Carole wants to add something, yes?
Can I answer the question from the public?
Of course you can. Yes, yes. I'm just going to. Oh, you've got it on. You can
I
read it
read
out
it.
as well. I'm just going to read it for our audience. So it just basically says, thank you, Nick, for the film, which covers a crucial period of Chile's recent history. My query is about the current position of social dissidents. I understand that as of December 2020, there were still over 200 political prisoners whose trials had not even commenced, some of whose charges were penalized severely for minor offences, such as graffiti being penalized with over 600 days in prison with arrest, and remain being used as a political tool to quash dissent. So Adriana would like to know what is happening with these political prisoners.
So I'd like to answer this question. Yes, Pinochet anti-terror laws are being enacted today. There are around 2,000, in fact more than 2,000 political prisoners in Chile at the moment. Many of them are minors, some of them are 15 years old. The charges are absolutely trivial. I mean, like graffiti, throwing a stone, or they plant evidence, like they say this person burnt this thing down with no evidence at all. So yes, not only are Pinochet's anti-terror laws being used, they are being strengthened. So Piñera has strengthened the LES, the Ley de Estado de Seguridad, I think it's called, but I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. He actually introduced La Ley Capucha, right, during the social protests, which meant that anyone who covered their faces was committing an offence. Basically, anyone who stood in the road can be put in prison for obstructing traffic. Anyone who writes anything against the state can still be penalised with these laws. So journalists are under tremendous pressure. And Chile Solidarity Network, we've actually just launched a project in England. We are sponsoring political prisoners because they are still in prison. There's a man in Concepcion called Carlos Peyrin, who we've just taken on. What we're doing is actually making the link between prisoners in Chile and UK groups, because we feel that international pressure is better. So a group of students in Sheffield have adopted this prisoner. They will write to him, they will write to the authorities, and we will put pressure on them. I'd say that political prisoners at the moment is a massive problem. They have done this to strike fear and terror into the heart of young protesters. And I would urge anyone who's in a trade union, who has any links to trade unions or any groups that are interested, to actually help us with this campaign and sponsor political prisoners, because yes, the Pinochet anti-terror laws are being used, and in fact there's new laws being introduced during the time of estallido social. So it's a very critical time for the political prisoners, especially as they're being exposed to COVID. I've written a few articles about this which I could post links to, so it's a big thing. Please help us to get these people out of prison. Yes.
Okay, and just a clarification there from Adriana. She says that it's actually 2,000, not prisoners, and not 200 prisoners. That's a figure that she's given us.
It's around 2,500. We don't know, because getting information from Chile is one of the problems, getting hard data.
Okay. All right. So if we'll proceed with other questions, of course. So I'm just wondering, in terms of, we said, you know, being skeptical of the political class and this entire process. And this question is for both of you. I mean, what do you think? I mean, one of the comments, or many of the, if I can summarize many comments that I've heard amongst the Chilean community here in Australia, is that okay, so while these protests are great, people are taking to the street. There was a plebiscite. The Pinochet Constitution was rejected, overwhelmingly rejected by the Chilean population. There's still no faith or belief in the traditional political parties of the country. So many people will ask, well, where are the new leaders? Where are the leaders that are going to become members of parliament, if that's a structure that's, you know, going to continue in the foreseeable future, that can be trusted, that are going to try and represent the people's interest, and not basically end up being, you know, to put it bluntly, a bunch of sellouts. Are there figures, are there parties that we be looking at with interest. Carole, and then Nick, yes.
So what I would say is that those leaders already exist. Those people are already organizing. They are ordinary people that are in la poblaciones. You know, you have a very strong feminist movement. They have quite a few leaders there that are, you know, very capable. You have Mapuche leaders that have been organizing against the dictatorship and then all of the repression they've faced. They know full well what the impact of the neoliberal model has meant for their communities. And we also have a lot of eco-warriors like Rodrigo Mundaka, who fights for water rights. So I believe that those leaders already exist. The thing is that they don't have a political home, which may actually be of benefit to them. So what we're hoping is that this process will allow them to arise as independents. Of course, they're not going to trust the political parties because they've all been engaged. They're all complices, you know, they have blood on their hands. So I personally believe that those leaders exist, but they don't have money and they don't have access and they don't have they don't have support from the media. So they're not widely known, only within their communities or within sort of groups that are interested in the work they do, which is a problem. It's about money, it's about financing. And I think it's, there's been this sort of slogan that I've not really liked, this whole thing about no hay partidos políticos ni líderes, which is, it's not going to work. You know, you need leaders, you can't, you know, otherwise it will descend into chaos. The whole thing has been very chaotic and messy. And that's the problem, you know, this lack of organization. But, you know, Chileans suffer from that chronically. I can say that as being a Chilean myself. So while the leaders do exist, they haven't got access and there's no coordination. So it is, yes, it's a worry.
Okay. Nick, your thoughts?
Yeah, so while I was out there, there's a couple of points I want to make kind of in relation to that that really struck me while I was there. And one was the absolute horizontal nature of everything that was taking place, of the protests, you know. It felt like that, which was inspiring in its own way because it meant everybody had a stake. You know, it was really, it was so organic, you know, it was so grassroots across the entire spectrum, which I thought was a strength, but also represented a major challenge, because the strength of that is there's no head, right? So you can't cut the head off it because it's not there, you know, because it's like that. There's no head, right? Which meant it was impossible for right-wing forces or moderates to kind of co-opt what was happening. And I thought that was a really positive and beautiful aspect of what was happening, that it really was a people's movement. As Carole says, that presents its own challenges because, you know, where's the vanguard? You know, where's what's the organizational process to take that forward and to change this huge pressure into tangible, you know, material goals and achievements. So that was one of the things that I thought, yeah, was as much a challenge as it was a beautiful symbol of what was happening. Obviously, you had the assemblies, which were part of that as well, you know, in taking that forwards. And then there was the Committee of Social Unity, which brought several organisations together. Well, at the time of the film, with the clip I used in the film, it's around 70, but it may have grown since. So, I mean, it's obviously a hugely democratic grassroots process. But I mean, I was also massively struck by how different it is to how we do things in Britain. I happened to be in Santiago on the 12th of December, which was the day of the general election in Britain. And I did get my vote in, I did a postal vote. And just 2 days before that, I'd been in Buenos Aires, and that had the new government taking office as well. But yeah, that's kind of another story, but it was also part of this whole thought process that I had. And, you know, being there, I was in a traffic jam and we got the election result. It was like 35 degrees. I was in a traffic jam and it was just devastating. You know, the British election result was devastating. We had an opportunity to put in a government that actually, you know, would have brought transformative change, or would have fought for transformative change for the benefit of the majority of people. And Britain voted for a right-wing government which does completely opposite. And since then, the British left has gone from a power of strength and possibility to basically capitulation. You know, certainly in a parliamentary capacity, in an electoral capacity. And all it took, well, I mean, there's factors behind the election defeat, but it basically took it was a landslide election defeat. And, you know, we've had no response in just over a year since. Even though we had this huge groundswell of support for left-wing and socialist policies in Britain. But it's just been allowed to be kind of blunted. And that shows the weakness of our system, of our movement, that we put far too much into parliamentary politics. And in Chile, it was the opposite. You know, it showed what is possible outside of the parliamentary system. And, you know, when you've got all the parties are discredited, you know, people had lost faith, it seems to me, in the Frente Amplio, which in 2017 had seemed to be a big source of hope to people. So things change fast, you know. And yeah, that was another really, really powerful lesson of everything I witnessed in Chile, was the, you know, the needs to bring politics far beyond the parliamentary sphere, which in Britain is, you know, the politics is so concentrated in that sort of Westminster thing. And in Latin America and elsewhere, you know, politics is lived in the plazas, in the streets, in the community assemblies, in the public kitchens, everywhere, you know, and everything is like that, you know, and discussion is taking place. Every street corner, there was groups of people just gathering and discussing what was happening, you know. Politics was on the walls because it was just sprayed everywhere. The demands were just sprayed on the walls all over Santiago, you know. And like, I just feel like we're so far from anything like that. And that's kind of sad. And another lesson why we should be looking towards Latin America, as we always should, because Latin America for so long, like, it can be a political nightmare, but it can also be a real source of political inspiration. And more often than not, I think it's an inspiration, especially, I mean, the people are an inspiration, you know. Sometimes, obviously, we don't get the results we want when we see people like Bolsonaro and Piñera, but I mean, you know, we have so much to learn from how people do politics in Latin America. And this film, I wanted to kind of bring that to people as well.
Once again, Nick, it was a fascinating film, a great contribution, and I certainly agree with you and with Carole. Latin America is certainly not examined and reported enough in the English-speaking media, and I think precisely because there are many interesting, fascinating, and inspirational political movements and developments over there, which place in, you know, countries like Australia, the United States, many parts of the world. We could take lessons from there. Thank you kindly to both of you for joining us, Nick MacWilliam and Carole Concha Bell. I just need to mention that for future events, our viewers can visit alborada.net/events for future online Alborada events. We're going to finish off with some music, but until next time, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you.